You guys know I love talking about Marvel novels, and I happened to come across one that I thought was really interesting called Mockingbird Strikeout. You know the name Mockingbird. You probably love her. She's got one of those followings in Marvel. And speaking of following, she has one of her own as well. Maria Lewis, author, thank you so much for taking your time. What are you doing?
Hi, thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for giving a shit. It's delightful to talk to people who are excited about the book.
I mean, how can you not be when you got a character like
Oh my
Mockingbird out in
God.
the forefront? We'll talk about, joining the Marvel world here in just a second. But I actually want to talk about Mockingbird because like I said, she's one of those it characters that has this like special following within the Marvel fandom. So how excited is it for you to tackle a character like this?
Oh, she was like a dream character for me. One of my favorite things about Marvel broadly is that I think they have one of the best toy boxes. Like, obviously, you have all of your characters that people are really familiar with in the MCU, your Iron Mans, your Captain Americas, etc. But because they have existed for so long, the benefit of that is you have this amazing deep bank of characters that would be considered like you maybe B or C list characters compared to your more well known ones, right? Even though Iron Man would have probably been considered B or C list until the MCU really took
Right.
off.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, 100%. So it has been something of a dream, I guess you could say, to get in there and to play with some of those characters that I loved that every time they made an appearance, whether it was usually small, but even if it was just like, Bobby pops up obviously a lot in West Coast Avengers. And I don't know if I necessarily would have been drawn to West Coast Avengers if I didn't know Bobby was in it. Like she was the reason I was reading that because I wanted every bit of Mockingbird I could get. And there's other characters like She-Hulk and Tigra, for instance, who are sort of within that world, and Black Widow for a big stretch there in the 90s. And so I was very excited because there's this bank of characters. Like X-Men, I think, also has a bunch of really great ones. Loa, for instance, who's a
Mm-hmm.
Pacifica X-Men. I'm Pacifica, so that's a character that I was always like, any little morsel of representation you're excited about. But also like your Jubilees, your Rogues, and any time that there was the possibility you could pitch on something like this, I was always telling myself it would never happen. But like you got to roll the dice. You know what I mean? You only need one yes. And so I had pitched on a whole bunch of characters, and Mockingbird I thought was going to be a long shot because I know she has a real cult fandom, and obviously she popped up in Agents of Shield, so her like general fan base has expanded a little bit because of Adrian Palicki's incredible representation of her on that show. So I was just cautiously optimistic that maybe she would be the character that I got to play with, and it ended up yeah, being the case.
So you're gonna make me go off my first tangent here for a second
Okay,
because of
go
what you just
tangent
mentioned.
away.
Just because what you just mentioned, you mentioned Adrian Palicki, and I
Yeah, I
totally
love
agree with
her.
you. I loved her portrayal of the character, but there was supposed to be a spinoff of
Yes, they
Agents of
shot
Shield,
it.
Most Wanted, that was
Mhm.
killed before it was even brought out. So I feel like fans are going to see this and be like, finally. Did you kind of have that feeling too, where you're getting to take this character and be like, okay, well, it might not be TV, right? You still
Mm.
get to finally give her the story that she deserves that she didn't get to have on television.
Yeah, well, the thing with Bobby historically, not just in the comics, but also like in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., you're part of an ensemble, right? So it's like you have a different character might shift through and they're leading the A plot week to week. But generally speaking, Bobby was kind of always defined by her proximity to men. Like her first introduction in
Mm-hmm.
Astonishing Tales, she was sort of like one of Kazar, which is such a bizarre character, one of Kazar's many hectic love interests. And Spider-Man, same sort of deal. She was like, I'm no femme fatale. And, that's just, it's a different time. You can't necessarily, I feel, judge things from the perspective of 2023 when it's written in, 1974 or whatever. So I had always been really intrigued and enticed by the prospect of sort of trying to liberate Bobby from the context of men, right? What happens when she really does, quote unquote, strike out on her own? And some of my favorite episodes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., particularly obviously season 2 and 3, are where Adrian Palicki plays Bobby and Nick Blood, who's amazing, I feel, as Lance Hunter, come into play. And Lance sort of being this problem solving character way to fix the issue of not being able to include Hawkeye in the TV series, but them still wanting to have this ex-husband plot point, right? Which is one of Bobby's big pieces of canon. I thought was a really clever solve for that. And I loved the chemistry and the magnetism between the two of them. When they got written out of the show to branch off and have their own pilot, which they shot, and I don't know, I'm sure you have sneaky people who've flicked you a link and you've
I
seen it.
haven't I haven't seen it. I'm trying, Haven't seen it yet. Wonder Woman's another story, but I haven't seen that
Oh,
one yet.
oh, enjoyed that as well for very different reasons. But it was one of those things where it's like you have to shoot your shot, right? Like the
Sure.
odds of Most Wanted could have been picked up and it gets 5 seasons. So them getting written out of the show would have been totally worth it. Tragically, it did not. But that was one of the angles I guess I'd always been intrigued with in terms of Bobbi. And I particularly I have 8 books before this that are all dealing with women who have various abilities, right? It's taking classic mythological monsters and giving them a feminist twist. So it's women who have to struggle with great power comes great responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them are villains, some of them are heroes, some of them are just in between. But the women who exist within the Marvel universe who for the most part are not super powered. There are obviously whole comic runs where Bobbi is or has, enhanced abilities. Those characters really intrigued me as well because it is this play field of like gods and monsters and how do you, not to quote the Dark Universe, but how do you operate through that world and like what kind of skills do you have to develop? And you're exceptional by anyone's standards, but yet there's a guy over here who can fly and there's a chick over here who's like a brilliant lawyer but can also turn green. And so that sort of juxtaposition of being exceptional and ordinary at the same time within an incredulous world, I think was such a rich playing field. And just having the real estate to spend, 85,000 words with Bobbi Morse, like I would have read any book. I have read every book with Bobbi because I love this character. And I just wanted to sort of try and balance that expectation of her legacy on the page and the screen, and like pay homage to that, be respectful to that, pay tribute to it, while also hopefully trying to take the reader somewhere new and take Bobbi fans somewhere maybe they hadn't been before.
How do you kind of make that balance though? Because you've got all that history, you've got all that canon, and we know how people feel about their canon, right? But then you've
Mm.
also got Maria over here, and you've got someone who's written like almost 100 Who's Afraid books and created so many characters. How do you balance the I want to bring a little Maria into this with also saying, okay, but I have to remember there's canon over here.
Well, it's really interesting because this year in particular, like 2023, I have 3 books coming out that are all so incredibly different from each other. Obviously, you have this Mockingbird novel, which is in the world of superheroes. I have a slasher called The Graveyard Shift, which is like a millennial scream coming out, and a murder mystery crime book. And then I have an Assassin's Creed novel coming out at the end of the year. So they're all incredibly different. And it had been sort of interesting, I guess, because with the Supernatural Sisters series, which includes Who's Afraid and The Witch Who Caught a Death and stuff like that, that spanned 8 books and many years and various short stories and whatever. And so you have this fan base that's really familiar with you, but then my primary job is as a screenwriter on film and television. And so there's an audience that comes with me from that who are familiar with my work through episodes that they've watched or things that they engage with on socials. And then there's things that I'm just passionate about, like geek culture, you know what I mean? Like I'm covered in pop culture tattoos. I really live wear my pop cultural passions on my sleeve, quite literally. So you have all these different audiences related to you that are coming to this book. But I would say majority of the audience, probably 85% of it, have no clue who I am and have never read anything I've written before and are coming to this because it's Marvel, because it's Marvel Heroines, which is a line that's like really has a very passionate fandom, and because it's Bobbi. And so it's a combination, I think, of trying to balance, well, understanding that you're probably never going to successfully appease everybody and sort of letting that pressure go, letting that expectation go, and trying to write the story that you feel best serves the particular narrative that you've set out to tell, the narrative that you've been greenlit to tell, because you have to go through a very extensive pitching process with Marvel approving at each stage of the pitching journey. So you can't just suddenly go off reservation and be like, surprise, there's dinosaurs now.
Oh wait, Moon Girl makes an appearance. Oh no.
Could you imagine? Oh my goodness, I would love that so hard. But yeah, somebody hired me for that book. But just being really conscious of trying to balance those two things.
So Bobbi's not going to ride a Velociraptor. Now I'm it's just totally ruined for me now, and I can't do it.
I feel like she has the Chris Pratt Jurassic World character. She would be a very good substitute there.
Oh, no
Her and
doubt.
Blue going off on adventures.
That would be fun. That would be fun. I would read
That
that.
would be fun.
Hello, if anybody's listening.
Studio crossover that literally nobody wants, but the two of us are
Well,
excited
I mean,
about
there's
it.
an audience right there. Then we'll just do that.
Exactly.
So Maria, it would have been really easy, right, to take a novel like this. You've got the Marvel logo on the cover to lean into comic book aspects of things like the super soldier serum, which you have in this book, and things like that. But I feel like at its core, to me anyway, this is really kind of a cross between like an espionage thing and female empowerment as well. Did you want to kind of give it a little bit different of an angle in that way, and not make it like too obvious of a, okay, well, this is a comic book story with a comic book character sort of thing? Did you want to give it, comics have deep meaning. I don't want to say they don't, but did you want to give it a little bit more of a different spin on what we've normally seen from Bobbi?
Yeah, I think also I was really interested again, like because she, in this version of the story and the pitching process of this, she was, it was specific that she had to have no superpowers per se, right? So for me to be able to ground the audience and ground the stakes, I wanted to try and keep her a little bit separate from that world. I also thought the canon, you can tell I've just been obsessing over Across the Spider-Verse. The canon event of her and Clint getting divorced is, I think, something that if there's one thing people know about Bobbi, it's probably that. That's probably in the top 3 things they know. So I really wanted to open with that and then immediately leave it. So we're subverting expectations of, if you're expecting this to be all about that, it's not necessarily, it's about the aftermath of that, right? And this idea of essentially trying to do a superhero divorce book, which is, some of my favorite comics of all time, are very adult themes within the package of the superhero mechanism and the superhero device. And so I was thinking about things like Out of Sight, the Steven Soderbergh movie, which is one of my favorite films of all time, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and this idea of a lot of tradecraft and a lot of spycraft mixed with chemistry and interplay between characters, but also wanting to move Bobbi away from a place that audiences felt they were very familiar with her in, which wasn't just the emotional relationship with Clint, but also the physicality of California. And so I looked at a few different options of physical settings and what I needed the story to service, this essential mystery where you could put all of Bobbi's strengths and all of her weaknesses on display to really dissect and dive into. And Oxford was an exciting option for me. I mean, it's just truly like one of the most interesting settings because there's so much rich history there. But there's also so much fascinating modern history there as well. And so many like different little options to play with without getting into spoiler territory, but it also brilliantly puts her in the backyard of Strike and meant that I could tap into the ring some of those characters that people might have been not as familiar with, not just Lance, but some of the other Strike entities as well, and try and take people somewhere that they haven't been before. Like my previous books, the Supernatural Sister series, each of those is set in a very specific geographical location, whether that's Berlin or whether that's, Sydney, Australia, or whether that's Boscastle in Cornwall or Dundee in Scotland. It was about doing a little bit of literary tourism, me going there and experiencing those places and speaking to people who lived there, researching them and making them feel lived in. And I wanted to do that with this story as well. I loved the idea of Werewolf by Night when that dropped, like the adaptation, I should say. But this idea of a one shot where you're taking something that people feel like they really know very well and then moving it somewhere unexpected and doing something unexpected with it. And this being just like a little capsule story. And that was my intent with this. Whether I succeed or not is really up to the readers, but that's what I was essentially trying to do.
No doubt. And obviously this is more about Bobbi than anything else. I feel like this book is, but you still have a mission, you still have a goal. And I feel like what you have is more of like a target than a villain. Like you kind of say, okay, well, every story, Marvel story has to have a villain, and you kind of do. So what made you decide to kind of go the route that you did of finding, I'm just going to say the word target because I don't want to spoil anything, obviously, but what made you decide to go kind of that route? How much can you tell us without spoiling anything?
Well, Bobby's backs, again, this is like the challenge of trying to balance things that are canon and what parts of canon you can keep, what parts you can change, etc. Because obviously things get updated, things change, things in retrospect, like either, super sexist or super racist or super whatever. And so you're constantly trying to stay faithful to the origins of the character while updating it for a modern audience and for a modern lens, which is what, for me, the best characters do, my favorite characters. I'm a big fan of the first masked superhero ever, the Phantom. I worked on an audio documentary about the Phantom, and what was so fascinating about that character, even though for the time that character was very progressive compared to other characters, it was something that it was this white man in the jungle, right? And it was really fascinating to watch how that character evolved and how that character then became essentially the Superman for Papua New Guinea, for India, for all these countries that didn't really get to see versions of themselves represented in comics. And so I'd always been really intrigued by that idea. And that was something that everything I approach, especially with legacy characters like this, it's sort of very similar with the Assassin's Creed book as well, is like, what is the thing that I can bring? And what is the thing that I love about the source material, and how can I infuse a little bit of myself into it, right? And in the case of Bobbi and the story and the target/villain, if you will, it was being aware that there'll be people reading this book who have no idea who Bobbi Morse is and might not be familiar with her backstory outside of, maybe one or two appearances, right? So again, you're trying to balance people who have lots of knowledge with people who may have none. And so I was trying to find ways to include people into the story rather than exclude them. So there's Easter eggs in there, obviously, if you are very familiar with who she is, but if you're not, there were still pieces that tied back to her origins. And I was trying to layer in some meaning there about the choices that we make when we're really young and really ambitious. And, you want everything right now all the time. And then how those choices and how those decisions can be colored as an adult when you're looking back. And, the things, it's like your first relationship compared to your fifth or your sixth, right? Or like how you raise your first kid compared to your fourth or your fifth or whatever, just the things that you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And so
no doubt
trying to layer that idea in the context of Bobbi, in the context of who she was as a woman, as a scientist, and as a spy, and trying to sort of balance each of those simultaneously all the time. I feel like I've said balance 25 times as if I'm in Cirque du Soleil or something, but
you're just trying to center us, make it more zen a little bit, which is this Zen Australian. You're the first Zen Australian ever.
Wow, I think you might be the first person ever in the history of my life to call me Zen, but let's roll with it.
You set me up for it.
Speaking
speaking of setting things up, though, because I feel like you talk about changes, and I feel like everybody in their own story, you have to make changes to certain things. How do you set a reader who's familiar with Bobbi and her story and is just this huge fan of hers? How do you set them up for something in a story like this where you're like, okay, this is going to be a little different. Don't freak out. How do you set a hardcore fan up for something like that so you don't have people screaming at you on Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that?
Well, I feel like people are always going to scream at you regardless. So you've just got to peace out and just like make your zen closure with it or whatever. But in this particular instance, I'm a massive fan. I love to love stuff. And I love all the characters that are in this book. I asked if I could use them because I love them and because I'm a fan of them. Maria Hill, Tigra, She-Hulk, even a little like sneaky Daredevil appearance, Lance Hunter, obviously, other characters who shall remain nameless but pop up in various instances. Hawkeye as well, big fan. But it was trying to sort of come to it from the perspective of like, I've been that person. I've been reading these books and these stories forever. I'm a massive She-Hulk fan, for instance. And I remember reading this book that came out, I want to say it was like 2014 by Marta Acosta, which was another Marvel novel. And it was called The She-Hulk Diaries. And I remember at the time loving She-Hulk on the page, but just feeling like that book really took it to another level. It was very adult. And the themes were very contemporary, and it was sort of like dealing with her as a woman and a corporate entity, and dealing with her as like a, somebody like as an adult, like as somebody with sexual agency and career drive and all these different things. And so that was very much like a touchstone for me, because I was just like, I loved that book and I loved what it had the capacity to do, but also I have read so much of the stuff, and I feel like lots of, for instance, Chelsea Kane did such an incredible job on her run. I don't want to do that. She's already done that.
Right.
And therefore I'm giving the true fans nothing if I'm just repeating that beat. So it was about trying to take a journey that felt gentle. You're taking somebody off the beaten path, but you're holding their hands while you're doing it. And I'm sure there'd be people who are going to be frustrated that there's not more Hawkeye in it, or there's not more whatever. But the reason I love Bobbi is because of Bobbi, not necessarily who she's in a relationship with. And the reason I love her is because of how smart she is, and how compassionate she is, and how empathetic she is, and how cunning she is. And like all of those different elements to her that make her special and have made her such a fascinating character historically. Those are sort of the things that I wanted to see. And it's not necessary, you won't pick up on all of them. And like the science has to be balanced with the physicality, and the physicality has to be balanced with the character stuff and your witty banter and all those things, but trying to have a really even mix of the core elements that make Bobbi who she is, while at the same time moving the story somewhere we haven't necessarily been before, which again, geography really helped with that, but so did choosing certain characters. And even things like the book opens at the Academy Museum in LA, which is, there have been lots of stuff with Bobbi set in California, but I was like, okay, what are the set pieces we have seen with her? Where are the places she has been physically and interacted with physically? And then where's somewhere new I can take her? And at that particular point of writing it, the Academy Museum had only just opened up. So I was like, okay, cool. I feel like we haven't had that many stories that have, had her riding the shark from Jaws into a crowd of baddies, just like relatable stuff.
That was definitely really fun. And if what she said didn't get you jazzed for this book already, then I don't know what to tell you, honestly. But I
feel
do
like
want
they're
to
going to
tease
be
ahead.
very mad at me destroying half of their museum on the page, but oh well.
Yeah, hopefully that doesn't actually happen in real life.
Yeah.
Before I let you go, Maria, you talked about Assassin's Creed a couple times now. How much can you tease for us about what's going to be coming from that? Because I mean, again, there's a lot of Assassin's Creed fans that are just itching for more Assassin's Creed stuff.
Yeah, it really blew me away, honestly. Every time I feel like I have a grasp of fandom, again, as mentioned, because I'm in it and I work in that space, something like the Assassin's Creed novel comes along, and the announcement of that just like shut down my phone for like 3 days. You don't forget, but you do kind of forget when you're really in it. I'm a huge fan of Assassin's Creed. I think anybody who loves storytelling loves and respects Assassin's Creed because of the world. And I also love, I guess I don't want to say alternate history, but things where there are stories woven in and around and amongst historical stuff that we know already, historical events. And so obviously this ties in with the upcoming Assassin's Creed Mirage, and the main character of that book, of that game, his mentor, Roshan, is the main character of this novel. So it's someone that you've had glimpses of in the games before. But again, similar to Bobbi, it's about spotlighting that character, giving them a whole platform to really, get to shine and get to understand some of her backstory, get to understand why she joined the Brotherhood in the first place, the things that are important to her, why she is the way that she is. And I've honestly really enjoyed the process. I love working with Ubisoft. I've worked on a game with them for the past few years, not Assassin's Creed, a different project. And just the amount of time and effort and energy they put into research, and they put into specificity as a storyteller, it's just like a dream come true that you have that much breadth, I guess you could say. It's very hard to talk about without spoilers, as I'm yammering around subjects.
Well, I can see them lording over us right now somewhere over in the
like,
distance saying, it's now
Get her off the
stop. But I mean, there'll be plenty of time to talk about that later. So, and I'm sure we'll definitely do that. But right now, we want to make sure you guys are focused on Mockingbird Strikeout, which is now available wherever books are sold. Consume it, love it, demand for more of it, and demand for more of her as well. Maria Lewis, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for the great questions.